and welcome to the Ancient Jesus Future Faith, I almost forgot the name of it, podcast.
Hopefully you, the listener, have not.
It's pretty bad. Great start, Tana. I am one of your hosts, Tana Sheaver.
Not for long.
I may be fired after this.
We're accepting applications.
And I am joined by my other hosts, Sarah Minardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hey.
And today we're going to continue our discussion on emotions. And we want to start today with joy and happiness. And I want to start, Sarah, by asking you a question, because at the very beginning of our last episode on emotions, you said something about joy versus happiness. And I was wondering if you could define the difference between the two.
Yes and no, because I don't really think that there is a difference between joy and happiness. In fact, in Christianity, we hear that a lot, that like joy is somehow more honorable or more spiritual than happiness. But prior to the 20th century, that they were synonymous, joy and happy. But in current times, it's like happiness is at best inferior to joy, or at worst just evil. And the Bible does talk about happiness, but joy and happiness are not contrasting. So it's one of those things where words have slightly like taken on a different meaning over time. But 100 years ago, every Christian knew the meaning of joy. It was happiness. But today we grope for words and we try to figure out, well, how do we explain joy? We try to figure it out. And all we know to say is that, well, it's definitely not happiness. It's like,
happiness is groping joy is what I heard out of all that.
So yeah.
Sarah, I love that you're just like, and yes, and move on.
Yeah, so it's a more recent development, this idea that joy is something different than happiness, which is, and part of like it was one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this on the podcast, because I think it can be symptomatic of, or it can be, we can probably find other examples of this too, but where in Christian circles, we take a word and attach super spiritual meaning to it and remove it from its like relatability to the world around us. So like, I think, is this what I said in the last podcast, that I had that Facebook memory pop up that was, forget happiness, give me joy. So like, obviously I was influenced by this thinking too, that like, I'm going to be a super Christian and I'm going to have joy and happiness doesn't matter. But we also see it too, that, when people say God doesn't want you to be happy, God wants you to be holy, or we think of blessed as being different than happy, but these words are much more connected when you actually trace it into Scripture than we're taught.
Yeah, it does feel, it's interesting because when you said something about joy versus happiness, and I thought, oh, are those two different things? Like at first that was my reaction of like, aren't those the same thing? But then when I started thinking about it more, I was like, I feel like the word joy feels more Christian-y, but I don't know why.
Yeah, that's that groping for explanation that we somehow feel like in our current, like, we've just been influenced to think that joy is more
because we attach like really Christian-y words to it, like deep abiding joy.
Yeah.
Right. Well, but I'd never heard anyone say deep abiding happiness. Right. We think of Happy Meals at McDonald's, but joy, joy to the world, Christmas season.
It's like happy is more shallow almost.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would say that is how it has evolved, at least in the minds of a lot of Christendom, is that happiness is a very surfacey, shallow emotion that might even be very, to use some of the terms that I've grown up with in the church, very secular.
Yeah.
And that we're not looking for that in our faith. We're looking for joy, right?
Yeah, and I think this just popped in my head when you said that it's like, if we super spiritualize this idea of joy, and joy is different from happiness, I think what people are trying to say is like, that I can feel joy when things are not going well. But I feel like in that case, we're running the risk of not allowing people to feel what they're actually feeling in a situation, because they might be feeling what have been, we've decided are the more difficult or unpleasant emotions, like fear, sadness, or anger, or disappointment. And it can be uncomfortable to be around people who are feeling that. But if people who are feeling those difficult emotions think that, well, I still have my joy, as if that, like, then it's just like putting a Band-Aid on it, or or they might feel shame that they're feeling these other emotions because they're supposed to be feeling this joy, which is like maybe this perpetual happiness in spite of anything. I don't know what it is we're trying to say with the word joy that it wasn't really ever meant to say.
That's really interesting. The word perpetual really got me, because it does almost feel like no matter what is going on in your life, you should have this like perpetual undercurrent of joy.
Yeah, that's how I see
Just
it.
as
It's
a
the
child
undercurrent,
of
just like,
God.
Well, let me read to you why.
Okay.
here we go.
James 1, verse 2. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So that verse, I think, is the verse
Yeah.
that has shaped this idea of count it all joy. But let me say, I don't think that's a proper application of that verse, because I believe it can be also said the same thing. Count it all happiness.
Yeah.
Right? That what I endured is not useless.
Yep.
What I endured, what I went through, what I suffered is not for nothing.
Yeah.
But instead, that something good is going to come out of that. It's happiness still works.
Yep.
But I would say that's not typically how we use the word happy, though we would recognize it used that way. And since we don't typically use it that way, we feel like we're nuancing it by saying, no, this is something different. This is joy.
Yeah, and I don't really hear that as saying you're going to feel joy or happiness at every moment of this trial.
No, in fact, it almost seems reflective.
Yeah, exactly. Or, and this I feel feels a big problem with emotions in the Bible, is taking verses like that and reading them as if they're commands.
Right.
Like, consider it joy. Like, you better be feeling joy, or do not
first
fear.
of all, it does just say consider.
Yeah.
Just think about it. Just ponder the possibility.
Yeah. But do not fear, do not worry. And then these are taken out as like commands, and like, oh, I'm feeling worry, so something's wrong with me. I'm feeling fear, or that's like sin. Something's wrong with me spiritually. When I see those things in the Bible, I see it as like a pep talk, or like,
well, it's
encouragement.
descriptive. It's descriptive. It's for that moment, for that individual, for those people listening. It's important to think about like the letters, the epistles particularly, is we're reading other people's mail.
Yeah.
Right. So like we don't understand everything that's going on.
Yeah.
And so when you read these things like do not fear or whatever, we need to take a break, take a step back and go, is this a command of God, therefore prescriptive to all people for all times and all ways? Or is this descriptive to this particular moment in time? And so you're 100% correct.
Yeah. So I saw this meme the other day. It said, do what makes you happy. But then they crossed off makes you happy.
Oh.
And added glorifies God, so that it says do what glorifies God. And then the comment underneath it was, our feelings are fickle, fleeting, changing. Our emotions can't be trusted. Our hearts can lead us astray. Our desires often aren't in our best interest. And this is my not favorite part. Pick up your cross, sis, and go.
Oh boy.
Wow.
I think I texted you about it because I got really riled up about it. I was texting Don because I'm like,
when I get 3 texts in a row from Sarah, I'm like, okay.
Oh, she's riled up.
and it was during one of your live streams, and I felt bad. I'm like, oh, but it was like the only time I had to be preparing. But I was like, oh, I'm interrupting him in the middle of the live stream.
I was very unhappy, but I was glorifying God, so it's okay.
I just think that image, there's so much here. Let's save that last line because I want you to speak into that as well. But if we start with the first part, do what makes you happy, but crossing that, do what glorifies God. Our feelings are fickle, fleeting, changing. Our emotions can't be trusted. Our hearts can lead us astray. Our desires often aren't in our best interest. So any thoughts about that first part?
Well, the very first thing that comes through to me is deep, abiding sadness.
Yeah.
Like almost, I mean, it's creating some emotion in me because someone just hyper spiritualized this thing that makes it feel almost impossible to argue against it in a setting such as online, like on Facebook. And to argue against it would be like, oh, you just don't love God or you don't understand. And it'll be thrown back at you in some way that you just aren't a good Christian or whatever, right? You'll be dismissed. But these are handcuffs. Like this is a torture device. That meme is not innocent. Whoever reposted it might have reposted it innocently. But these are invisible handcuffs to people to keep them in a place that then is filled with guilt and shame about wanting to be happy.
Yeah. Unless you're doing what we tell you is glorifying to God.
Yep. And if I remember correctly, the meme, because you shared a picture of it with me, it's very pretty.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like
coral and blue and
they're fuzzy handcuffs and not for the fun part.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's really dangerous and harmful.
Because I think glorifying God is such a complicated thing to specify. So like to put it against each other, it sounds like you just have to like just agree with it. And then like the control comes in, like when people come in and say, well, this is glorifying to God and this is not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You stay home with the kids, that's glorifying God. You going to the workplace is not, as an example.
And I would say that meme visually definitely was aimed towards women.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And I'm feeling all of that for women too. But what I'm getting a little emotional right now. So good on
We're
brand
so
for the
sad
podcast.
in the happiness
Welcome,
podcast.
welcome to the happiness episode.
No, because I feel like this is also weaponized against clergy and their family. Because it's a calling, right?
Yep.
And so, Don has had this calling for 20 years to be a pastor. And it's almost like the verse with like the consider it joy and then things like this, do what glorifies God, crossing out the happiness part. That feels like a message that we've received for the past 20 years, which is like your individual happiness doesn't matter. Like your happiness as a family and your individual happiness is secondary to the call on your life. And if the call means that you struggle financially or that you don't have the kind of support you need or that you have to constantly put aside your own needs in favor of someone else, then that's okay. Consider it all joy and glorifying God. Mm-hmm. I struggle a lot with that.
Yeah.
The other big assumption there, Sarah, that I'm sure you're going to kind of lead us into, at least at some level, is that those two are opposed to each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like it implies that if I were to take stock right now and discover that I'm happy, then I start to question, well, then am I glorifying God?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a quote, I think it was Irenaeus, who I have no idea who that is or why I remember that that's the person that said it. But the quote is, the glory of God is a human fully alive, or vice versa. A human fully alive is the glory of God. And I remember when I read that quote, and in my workplace, there was this woman and she just like always seemed so happy. And like, to me, I saw the glory of God in her because she was just always happy. And like, I think society or my coworkers might have labeled her as a little bit like eccentric or like simple or goofy or like, but like she just carried this like so much happiness around with her. And I happened to be reading the book that I saw the quote in, and I was like, she just exemplifies this to me, that the glory of God is a person who is fully alive. And so if there's no more thoughts on that section, the last sentence, the pick up your cross, sis, and go, it's just so obscene to me. Like, what the heck? Like, what do they mean by this? Pick up your cross, sis, and go? Like, where am I going carrying a cross naked? Where do you want me to go? Because you're talking like, it's just, I don't know. It's so obscene to me, that last line. And I know that is it in Matthew where Jesus says, deny yourself and pick up your cross. So I think that's a difficult verse. I'd like to spend some time talking about that because that is another verse that gets taken out and applied in these situations. But I'm sorry, like me cleaning up Cheerios for the 4th time in one day is not picking up a cross. And the weird thing is that like, I feel like this group of people who like cheer on these kind of memes are the same people who are like, who celebrate children and multiple children and big families and homemaking, and they celebrate all that. Mm-hmm. So like, how are you in one breath celebrating this life, then calling it a cross in the other breath?
Yeah. Maybe they meant Pinterest. Pick up your Pinterest.
I have often wondered about that. Taking up a cross, the verse, and I've just heard that a lot. Like, we all need to carry our own crosses, and that's my cross to bear. And like, I don't feel like I've fully ever understood what people really mean by that, because how many of us, like, is there some metaphor I'm missing? Because like, Jesus carried the thing that he was nailed to.
It is a misappropriation of that verse, which is often done and causes harm. We could do an entire episode on that verse, deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. Right? Sarah, is this the time you want me to kind of go into it? So I'll try and keep it brief, and maybe we'll decide to do a fuller discussion on this. But first of all, Jesus is talking to people getting ready to enter discipleship. One of the things the church has made a mistake on, that I say often, is saying that everyone is disciples. Everyone is open to becoming a disciple, but not everyone is a disciple. There are some people that believe in Jesus who are not currently being discipled, are not disciples of Jesus. They're part of the crowd. Like, you think about when Jesus feeds the 5,000 or whatever, he sees the crowd, but he's not confused about who's his disciples and who's the crowd. When the crowd is pushing in against him at the sea, he turns and tells his disciples to go across the sea and he'll catch up later. and then looks back at the crowd. Jesus never confuses the crowd with the disciples. Churches have failed to do discipleship. And because of that, they just say the whole crowd, everyone that shows up Sunday morning, are disciples. And that just fundamentally is inaccurate to the way Jesus thought. Okay? I get words change, they develop, whatever, but that's just not. So when we take language, when Jesus is speaking specifically to disciples or calling people into discipleship, and we apply it to everyone, it causes a lot of confusion. This is one of those instances. Jesus is making very clear to people that were interested in becoming a disciple, moving out of the crowd and into discipleship, that in so doing, you are giving up a lot of the things that you have the freedom to do right now. And instead, you are going to follow me to your death, most likely in this scenario where we're currently occupied by Rome, and we can be put to death. Think about Jesus when he is actually carrying his cross. Simon, walking by, Rome was able to pluck someone just wandering by and force them to carry Jesus' cross. This is not a free society thing.
Yeah.
Like literally they grab someone that's just walking by and force them to carry the cross for Jesus. Yeah. So this is a very different scenario than I would say probably all of our listeners are in when they're thinking about this. Jesus is saying, what I'm going to call you to, the way I'm going to call you to live, the way I'm going to expect you to reshape your life is as a living sacrifice. And in so doing, you're opposing empire. You're disrupting empire so much that you have to know where this path ends. And I'm just not sure that in the U.S., any of us are picking up that kind of cross.
Yeah.
Right.
And so to use it here, especially after talking about happiness and discounting happiness, Jesus talks people all the time out of discipleship. You're not ready. No, don't follow me. Go back to the village and tell them what God has done. No, go bury your father. No, go do this, right? Jesus is, there's no place that the Messiah even has to lay their head. Go back. Jesus is always talking people out of discipleship. Another example is saying discipleship means denying yourself and carrying a cross, carrying your own torture device from empire. So this is where I think it could get complicated with talking about happiness. I think some people are called uniquely to sacrifice more than others to ensure a opportunity for others to experience happiness. I would say it's similar to like we often hear people speak about the military, right? People that go and put their lives on the line so we can have our freedom, right? And we celebrate that as I think there's room to. I think there's room to critique militarism as well, but the individuals doing this is something that's unique and powerful. And for most of us, we can't understand why someone would willingly sign up to go put their life on the line. The same thing is true in discipleship. And if you ever want to see how neutered we've made Jesus, how neutered we've made the gospel, how neutered we've made the Bible, just take a look at what we expect from people with discipleship, which is usually a commitment of 3 to 6 weeks on a Tuesday night for an hour and a half. And that's what we expect of you from discipleship. So, like I said, this could be an entire podcast, so I will stop there.
Yeah. That's so great, though, because even just listening to you sharing that, it just makes me appreciate the disciples in the Bible so much more. And like for the first time, even though I've heard you talk about this before, it just really struck me this time of imagining them hearing that, deny yourself and pick up your cross. And if they looked around or walked far enough, they would see crosses.
They would see crosses.
And those crosses were not empty.
They were not.
So the impact of that statement in that historical time period, it's just,
Yep.
Yeah, it's very impactful.
Yeah, you'll be criminalized. Your reputation will be shot. People will say that you are an enemy of the state. All of these things.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is another instance of the prescriptive versus descriptive kind of.
Yeah, I think so. Because again, Jesus is talking about those that are interested in following him. And that's not the same language as believe in him. Right? And this is discipleship language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think another word that gets contrasted with happiness that we see all over Scripture is blessed.
Hashtag blessed.
Yes. And similar to joy, at one time, blessed was synonymous with happiness, but over time, it's kind of been like one of those words whose meanings has just been, it's just like white noise. It's like one of those Christian words we just say sometimes and don't even like stop and think about what it means. So again, it just falls into this like super spiritualized word. So this book, there's this book, Happiness, by Randy Alcorn. A lot of like my thoughts on happiness and emotions were impacted by that book. And this book, I'm going to grab it because I'm going to forget the title. This is from Father James Martin. He's a Jesuit priest, and he's hilarious. But he wrote this book, Between Heaven and Mirth, Why Joy, Humor, and Laughter are at the Heart of the Spiritual Life.
Did you say heaven and mirth?
Mirth, yeah. And he actually worked at the parish of the Catholic school I taught at in New York, so I knew him personally to some degree.
Is this the guy that's in with Sojourners?
I don't know.
It's the same. Okay.
So I wanted to point out both the books and have a brief caveat of saying that I strongly believe that reading a wide variety of sources is important. And we're going to talk about many books that we've read over the years on this podcast. And it's not necessarily that we're saying that every word in a book is something that we agree with or that we...
Sure.
So just to say that, because I just think it's an important
Look,
note.
a perfect example of that is you quoted Irenaeus, who is one of the most anti-Semitic people
right.
Early on.
Which is why I felt the need to say I don't know anything about this person.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, that doesn't mean that someone that has this other stuff that we don't agree with, or maybe we even hate about them, that there aren't some pieces that have value.
Yes. So in Randy Alcorn, in his book, it's very thorough, and he traces every instance of happiness, joy, blessed in Scripture.
What was the name of Randy Alcorn's book?
Happiness.
Oh, it's just called Happiness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have it here too. But so he traces it all back to these Hebrew words of Makarios and Asher. And Makarios is the one that you most see in the New Testament, and Asher you see more in the Old Testament, especially in most of the usages are actually in the Psalms. So like, how happy is the man who, but sometimes those are translated as blessed. And there is actually another Hebrew word that more closely means what we take blessed as now, and that's barak. And an example of that would be like, King Solomon shall be blessed. More of like this divine favor type of idea. But blessed has been put in, like these words that also mean happiness have been translated as blessed. And as a result, because we don't hear it in the same way, we're missing I think we're just missing like a piece of what the text is saying to us. So even the Beatitudes, that are always blessed are, it's the same word as happiness. So if you think of the Beatitudes, happy are the poor in spirit, it adds a totally different tone to it.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons actually that I picked up a Holman Christian Standard Bible, because they use the word happy more for some of the translations, but they still, with the Sermon on the Mount, keep it as blessed.
Interesting.
And then Randy Alcorn, he says in his thing that he was talking to colleagues about that he's writing a book about happiness and the happiness of God. And somebody had said to him, like, well, you're not going to call it happiness, are you? Like, it's just how we've gotten to this point where it's not...
it's not spiritual enough.
Yeah, happiness is not spiritual enough. But at a different time, joy and happiness and blessed, these were all like synonyms. So it can change how we read the text when we look at the root words that have been translated and open up their meaning.
Yeah.
So
this whole changing of the perspective or the mindset around happiness reminds me, I hear people lament, and when I say people, I mean older people, lament about how these young people are more interested in taking pictures of their food and doing videos of themselves dancing in a public place than they are about reading a book. And there's a part of me that just finds that
Interesting.
so confounding.
Yeah.
That clearly these young folks have found things to celebrate and be happy about and enjoy and want to share with others that is fun. And there is a certain level of looking down your nose at that.
yeah.
I wonder if any of this has to do with a concern about like hedonism.
Hedonism was exactly what came to my mind a few minutes ago when Sarah was talking about the different usages of the word. What's fascinating about that is that John Piper wrote a book where he emphasized Christian hedonism. And I forget the name of the book. It's probably his most famous book. But
There's one called Desiring God.
That's
Is that it?
Yeah, I believe so. Now, I do not share many beliefs with John Piper. But in the book, he does argue at some level for a Christian hedonism, an excitement and stuff. But that's what I was saying is that's kind of surprising to me is that in a more conservative Christian circle, one of the preeminent voices for that, John Piper, actually seems to support Christian hedonism.
Can you explain hedonism?
Hedonism is like the perspective of self-serving, fulfilling your desires,
Okay.
Just seeking pleasure above all else.
Okay.
which is why Desiring God
Right.
is about desire. And so I don't really remember the specifications of the book. It's been way long and ago that I read it, but I think there is something to, man, it's going to be hard to say because I want to nuance it so bad. But there is something to the idea of us being hedonistic and that it is okay for us to seek out the things that we desire that make us happy, that bring joy, or happiness. They're not different words, Don. That bring happiness to the people around us, bring happiness to ourselves, and that we don't need to feel guilty about that because I would argue God put these things in our midst for us to enjoy, not to tempt us away from glorifying God.
Yeah.
Right?
And just as you're sharing that, and because you're my friend and I care about you, but me just imagining like you being happy and doing things that make you happy, it makes me happy.
Right.
Just like it would make me happy like when my children are happy.
Right.
And to celebrate that and like, yeah.
I was just gonna say I do. It's interesting. I never realized that Piper argued for like a Christian hedonism. I never realized that's what Desiring God was about. It makes sense now with the title, but even if people don't identify with the word hedonism. I do feel like there is this undercurrent of Christianity that has a suspicion of
Yes.
that kind of like almost like pursuing happiness is inherently bad. Like
Or just less than.
Yeah. And it's somehow moving away from God rather than toward God, or at the best it's neutral.
In the Venn diagram of godliness and happiness, there's just a sliver.
Just a sliver, just like
overlap.
a sliver. Yeah. And I think part of that might have to do with the fact that, like, think of all the things that a lot of more conservative Christians will critique. And it's things like the LGBTQ community, any kind of like sexual pleasure that is not in like a certain very distinct tiny category, right? And even like tattoos or like, like there's all gambling, there's all kinds of things. And these are all things that are like pleasurable for people, like that make them happy either as a hobby or as a fulfillment of who they are or whatever. And a lot of more conservative Christians will be like, those things are sinful.
But yet love sports.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. But it is this, I think there's like this inherent suspicion of like, I don't know, like that pleasure, like you have to be suspicious of it right away.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. And back to Father Jim's book, he says, I think this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but in history, the definition of Puritanism, the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy.
That's definitely tongue in cheek, but that's hilarious.
But yeah, puritanical. That's
Yeah.
one of the words I was looking for earlier.
And he says that as Christians, we're more concerned with sin than with virtue. We point out the ways we fail rather than suggest ways we might flourish. The thou shalt nots overshadow the thou shalts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely want to make sure that as we, Ancient Jesus Future Faith, as well as a plethora of other organizations, church leaders are thinking about what is the current blossoming faith expression, right? That debated whether it's post-evangelical, whatever. I don't care about the name, but while we're wrestling with what is next, I think what has to be at its core is happiness. I think what has to be at the core is this sense of being able to celebrate.
Yeah.
Right. That was a decision I made early on in our church plant, was that I wanted to have at the beginning of every time when we sat down for people to share celebrations about their week. Yeah. I deliberately called it celebrations because I wanted it to be people sharing things that didn't necessarily have God obviously attached.
Like I had an amazing pizza the other night.
But if you say praises,
yeah,
people immediately are like, God provided or this, and make it and eliminate some of the things that are just happy. Like I'm celebrating that I got a new high score in Tetris.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Like
that wouldn't be considered a praise.
Right.
It's too shallow to be a praise.
But I would say for someone who, and I don't play Tetris, but I showed my age by picking that video game.
Candy Crush.
But people dedicate a lot of time to playing those games and honing their skills in it. And someone might have, for the first time in 5 years, exceeded their previous high score. Why should we not be happy for them?
Yeah.
Because for them, it's something they do that's fun. It's something that they do that relaxes them. It's something that takes their mind off things. And yeah.
Well, just think about the phrase guilty pleasure.
Yeah.
That immediately
implies,
discounts so many things that people enjoy doing, like some of those video games. I most often hear it with like TV shows, like certain TV shows are like, oh, the Bachelor is my guilty pleasure or whatever. But that's a very telling phrase. Yep. It's like, oh, I can't enjoy this bit of happiness.
Right. And I know it sounds silly, but I really wanted those celebration times to be kind of almost silly.
Yeah.
And that people would be like, they're celebrating that the next season of their favorite show just came out.
Yeah.
And that they're looking forward to that. And that's something that brings them happiness. And I just think that's so significant because I don't think we spend enough time asking people what makes them happy.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important. And I think it started off that way and it kind of got away from it and became more like, oh, what are your praises? And it was like, oh.
Yeah, I have a tendency to let the community shape where things go.
Sure.
And I think people kind of fell back into their more normalized things. But we still get a smattering. And usually the kids start
It's
it.
the kids, yeah.
A kid will start and just be like, give some absolutely random thing.
Right, like I had animal crackers this morning. Like, oh, yay.
But it's such a beautiful thing because when we hear what makes somebody happy, we're getting a little window into them.
Yeah, and if someone ever does say a season of something just came out, everyone laughs.
Yeah.
And it's not laughing at the person. It's kind of like...
It's relatable.
It's relatable. That's a great word.
Yeah.
And
It's
it can
like,
build
oh, I feel that.
connections like, I like that show too. You know, there's so much relationship health that can happen there. And I also think that it's like moving away from compartmentalizing the secular and the sacred.
Yes.
And so that if our church doesn't feel like it's so separate from the rest of the world.
Yes.
That this is just a place where we gather and we catch up with our friends and we share what we're excited about and we share what's hard and we, that like bringing people into that space, it's not as much of like a culture shock or a separate thing to create like this kind of community that the secular and the sacred worlds are just like combined because we can see God in the pleasure that these things bring these people that he created.
Yeah. Rabbi
God created.
Heschel says the road to the sacred is always through the secular.
Yeah.
Well, and I was thinking along the lines of what you were saying, Sarah, too, when you were saying about the celebrations and like, oh, you kind of wanted to be silly but it feels like it has to be like so serious and like, and immediately the phrase that went through my mind is the whole like, oh, we're supposed to be in the world, but not of it, and so it does feel like, oh, well, church is not the place for me to celebrate that I'm so excited that the new season of Mythic Quest came out. Like it just, because that's feel like that's in the world and that's like of the world and like, yeah.
Of the world is contributing to oppression. Of the world is overthrowing of justice. Of the world is holding people back from fullness of life.
Yeah.
So in a setting where you have Rome holding people in occupation, and Jesus says we are to be in the world, but not of the world. We are here, but our role is not like Rome's. Our job is not that of Rome's.
That is very
different.
Very important context for that verse.
Yeah.
And that hits so different because I've always heard it used as like against any kind of progression.
Because Jesus was seriously worried in that moment about people binge watching Netflix. I mean, that's out of all the things that Jesus was concerned about.
To you.
When Jesus is saying this, as there are bodies, as you mentioned earlier, on crosses around you,
right.
And Rome is just plucking people off the street to do their bidding, and Jesus is like, and listen, at the end of the day, I do not want you being happy about watching Netflix.
Woe to you who have autoplay on.
Full disclosure, I forgot that was a Bible verse. I thought it was one of the things that like...
Oh, people say.
Yeah, that like somebody said and everybody adopted like the joy versus happiness type of thing. So I forgot that was even something that Jesus said.
Gosh, first of all, Don, thank you so much for providing the context for that. Because I don't think, if you have taught that before... I apologize because I forgot, but I don't think we ever really discussed that verse before. And
no, I don't think I've really taught that, at least not in a very long time.
Yeah. And so that really, I don't want to be of the world that's oppressing people and causing injustice.
And I think when you first say that, people go, oh, okay, I get that. But when you actually put Jesus in his context and say, Jesus was not worried that you shopped at the Gap.
Yeah.
Like, do you think that God incarnate in that moment of just destitution of people was
Right.
like, and listen, you should buy your pants at Costco.
Yeah.
Like, what?
Go ahead, Sarah.
I mean, this is the whole thing. Ancient Jesus, future faith, like understanding
Yeah.
ancient Jesus so we could move forward with our faith.
100%.
Yeah.
Like, I actually imagine,
Way to bring the brand in. No, I'm just kidding.
but I actually imagine Jesus in a setting where this concept of in the world as opposed to of the world, right? I don't think Jesus would lament that there came a time in history where you and I existed in a space where we could enjoy things safely and without worry. I don't think Jesus would be lamenting that.
Interesting.
I think Jesus would be like, the gospel might be spreading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, salvation for all people might be happening. Safety, you can actually sit in your home safely and not worry that someone is going to burst through your door and arrest you and drag you out. Now, I realize that there are still communities in this world that have that fear, and so it is not done. The kingdom is not done breaking forth. So the one warning I would give us is that our own personal safety, we're not to be like Noah, where we're only worried about our own safety from the flood, our own safety from the dangers that exist in the world, but that we're also concerned about the safety of others as well.
And you just jumped right into what I was going to say, which is, you said that I would love to see us moving forward. A part of our future of our faith is celebrating happiness and being happy and pursuing happiness. And I immediately was thinking, but also in a communal way too, like not just being like you said earlier, Sarah, like, oh, if something you did, Don, made you happy, that makes me happy. And I think that's one part of it. I think that's an important part is celebrating each other's happiness, but also in addition to the ways in which we try to serve each other very physically and meet each other's needs, how amazing would it be if Christians were known for making other people happy? Mm-hmm. Not just like, I think there's a difference between providing a meal to somebody and meeting that specific need, which may make them feel content or relieved, and it might make them happy. But then there's this whole other level that we could ramp that up to that I sometimes feel like we stop at the needs, right? Mm-hmm. We're just like, oh, well, and actually sometimes almost to a really detrimental point, right? Where I've heard people be like, well, why do those poor people have a satellite dish? Like they can't, it's like they're poor and, why should they have pleasurable things? It's like your needs are met. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that one of the major images for the Messianic era, which as a Christian, that means we believe we're in, is a Messianic era, is a huge table that is a feast, right? Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I have some family issues. And so holidays and feasts aren't necessarily always delightful in my mind. But the idea of sitting around this huge table with an abundance of food and a feast
Pots of meat.
About happiness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it is, that's the whole picture. That's the whole visual of the Messianic era is sitting around this huge feast, the feast of the Messiah. Like how awesome is that? And it's not like everyone got an appropriate portion.
Right.
And
it's not little plates with portions on them. It's a
like
table.
I imagine it to be decadent, not minimal.
See, I'm half Italian, so I feel this because it's like the meal is not just a perfunctory feed people thing. It is, in fact, sometimes to our detriment, a little bit so much like stuff until you're way too full. Like, we're just going to keep feeding you.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Don, isn't there, when you and I were chatting about the deny yourself, take up the cross. Wasn't there a communal aspect about that too that you threw in there that I don't think you mentioned when we touched on it earlier?
If you remember any element of it, I would be so grateful for you to hand that element of it to me.
I think I might be able to find it in our text, but I think it was something like that. If we are thinking about carrying the cross, that Jesus wasn't just carrying a cross for his own benefit.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So when Jesus takes up the cross, he's taking the pain, the suffering, the oppression of the world upon him.
Yeah.
And that when we take up our cross, we are also called that those of us who enter into that place, that relationship, that we need to recognize that the cross isn't just about us. If we believe that something mystical in the metaphysical in the world happened on that cross, and Jesus is inviting us to participate in it, then it's not just about us. We're carrying the sins. And I think we see that with martyrs all the time, right? Yeah. MLK murdered, but part of that murder and that cross carrying that he did there led to many people being freed in very unique and beautiful ways. And so MLK didn't imagine that his life was solely his, and the sacrifice and the cross that he was carrying was only for him.
Yeah. I thought that was an important piece, and it popped in my head that it hadn't come out earlier, so I wanted to circle back.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. That's so kind of tying everything together. It's really, the taking up the cross thing, and the kind of adding in the let's celebrate happiness. I'm making a connection in my mind, but I'm having a hard time articulating it.
Well, it's because I think part of the reason you might have trouble articulating or making a full-fledged connection is because we made those diametrically opposed.
Yes.
Or we made one to be godly and one to be shallow.
Right.
And I'm going to bring it back to what I hear people talk about with the military all the time. Like when Kaepernick was taking the knee, and he actually sought out a vet to find out what's the best way to do this. And one of the things that you hear from a lot of people in the military about that is, I fought so you would have the right to take that knee. Mm-hmm. I would argue Jesus took up the cross so we'd have the ability to be happy. Mm-hmm. That you and I, in certain circumstances, when we're called to do something of significance that's setting aside some of our well-being or some of our own freedoms in order to increase the freedom of others, whatever it might be, that sacrifice is only worth it if people that come along behind us have more freedom, can experience more happiness. That's part of the goal.
Yeah.
And so they're not diametrically opposed. One is saying, in certain circumstances, this is necessary, and boy, do we wish it wasn't, but it is. And since it is, there are some of us who are going to do that. But that, again, is descriptive, not prescriptive. Not all of us are called to be martyred.
Yeah.
That isn't our goal. As a Christian, your goal should not be to be martyred.
Yeah.
That's a strange goal.
Yeah.
The goal should be to live a faithful life and bring joy and happiness and safety to all the people that you can. And some of us might die in the midst of that. But they're not opposed. They go hand in hand. One is necessary for the other.
Yeah. I was thinking too about, imagining back to when you were talking about the celebrations and being silly, and the church being a place where people are silly or people are laughing. Laughter is physically healing.
Yeah.
It cleanses the body of stress hormones. I took notes. Cortisol, breaks negative thought cycles, releases feelings of anxiety, sadness, and fear. And if we want the church to be a place of healing, then laughter can be a part of that.
Oh, yeah.
I actually read the happiness book several years ago, but I read it with my younger sister together, and we talked about it a lot. And when we realized that, we're just like, we just decided in our lives that anytime we started laughing, that we would just purposely try to prolong it as much as possible to get the healing benefits. So we would just like keep laughing. And, but yeah, so if we want the church to be a place of healing, then laughter can be a part of that.
Probably should be.
Should be. Yeah.
And I think another dichotomy that I think exists in most people's mind that I don't think is there is that being silly, laughing, means a lack of seriousness. And I would say that some of the most serious people about studying Scripture are some of the funniest people I've ever met.
Yeah.
And are happy. Yeah. And I think we think that we have to take Christianity or our faith just so, like, why so serious, right? That we feel like that pressure. And part of taking it serious is to bring all of you to it.
Yeah.
And all of you includes happiness, laughter, humor, wit, sarcasm, right? Those things all belong in studying the text and living a faithful life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And living a free life, because like humor can actually, I mean, one of the reasons that people in power don't want to see humor is because humor can be used to poke at and attack people in power.
Oh, comedians.
Sure.
Comedians are some of the most subversive
Yeah.
individuals. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, we're getting close to the end here. So
Wait, that sounds daunting. Ominous.
You heard it here, prophecy, folks. The end of this particular podcast episode.
Thank God, I was worried.
Yeah. So are any final thoughts on joy, happiness, everything we've talked
I think
about?
Ren and Stimpy said it best.
Ren and Stimpy. Oh my God.
Happy, joy.
Oh, honey, your pop culture references are always so old.
I remember them when they were on MTV, not even Nickelodeon.
Oh my goodness. Sarah?
The adult in the room.
Can you top Ren and Stimpy?
Well, at the risk of introducing a whole nother idea instead of summing up at the end, I just wanted to add that God is happy. Mm. And imagine God liking you.
Man, I'll bet you a lot of people have a hard time with that.
I'm thinking you do, Tana, as I saw you take a deep breath and sit back.
Yeah.
God likes you, Tana. I just felt like Fred Rogers there.
Yeah. All right, quality kid TV show recommendation.
Yeah, that is quality human. Thank you, Sarah.
I like you too.
I like you too. I like you too, Don.
Just feeling left out.
Oh, man. That got me emotional right at the end. Sarah. Okay. So, yeah. And any other thoughts?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. So we're happy, joy, and God is happy. And God likes us. I think those are good places to end.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us today. If you want to find out more about us or find links to any of our other things, including our YouTube channel, you can go to ajffpodcast.com. And if you want to support the work we're doing, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/AJFF and tip us or become a supporter there. And thank you. Glad you could join us today. Hope you can find some things to bring you happiness this week.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.